that's gross.
I meant...
These guys need to stop coming on us.
Dude, that's gross. Dude, that's gross. Dude, it's gross.
Kaido-san.
That's gross.
Jack, you're back.
I do want to warn you here before I start talking that this is going to be defending Alex Mahon, and that I do hope that the viewer is mature enough to have a conversation about something that covers a very ugly side of the industry and acknowledge that we can observe the actions of a horrible person, and allow people to make a bit of a case in their defense for even just a couple minutes without reverting to our biases so that we can try to move on from a precedent that his critics left behind. I want to argue that the criticism about Alex Mahon's code froze video game programming discussions because it was designed to be unfair for a programmer as a means of public shaming, but rather than being observed as a joke, the audience that weaponized it failed to understand its purpose, and through years of repetition and a loss of context, people accidentally treated it as a fundamental expectation for what a developer should know, thus creating a needless controversy every single time a new source code discussion is brought up for years to come. It doesn't help that with the information we have about him now, makes this little chat a lot harder to look at, because the internet really likes to do this guilt by association bullshit where you aren't allowed to defend someone if they did a bad thing, and doing so only means that you endorse them, which, like, no. We have like 4 years of evidence that the guy is not exactly a moral compass here. I just don't see what someone is supposed to gain from me being the 25th documentary about his bad behavior, because that should just be something you should already know at this point. But if you still don't know who this guy is or what he did, here's a couple videos. Here's a blog post talking about some of the stuff he did. Here's an article about him admitting to grooming a minor. While we are going to be questioning the motivations for a very large portion of the people that are criticizing the developer here, that is not to say that the entire discussion about Yandere Dev is unfounded. I mean, come on, we have 4 years worth of talking points that can be used to say that I'm wrong here. I take issue with the fact that despite being a well-documented discussion, without fail when it goes to the part about his programming skills, the things I've seen people say gives the impression that they somehow know even less than Alex Mahon. Because they probably do. Every time I see people talking about his code, it's quite obvious they don't actually understand what is wrong with his code architecture and are just calling it bad because others are saying it's bad. You can kind of imagine what happens when someone drops some source code that uses a similar architecture.
Oh.
The big motivation for why I wanted to talk about this guy was from the incident regarding the Balatro source code being leaked, and my theory that it only became controversial because we conditioned people to be blindly mad at that type of code. Expecting a wave of hatred towards the developer, many people rushed to defend the code like their life depended on it, to the point that people were going after game developers for simply talking about the code. The key point here is that they expected a hate wave, but why? Generally speaking, most gamers don't know jack shit about coding if they even care about game development as much as people think they do. When gamers talk about developers being lazy, they usually actually mean that they didn't have a shiny new thing to play with and not the everything else a developer had to do to get that content in there in the first place. If it doesn't have a tangible metric that can be measured in terms of is it new content, gamers usually are not going to give a shit about it, or they will generally dismiss it to argue that a game is being neglected by the developer. So the Balatro Lua file being criticized should have been relatively uncontroversial, unless you were being a dick to the developer. That is not what happened when the source code leaked though, and it's kind of interesting that this was all over some harassment that never happened. One would assume that this was anticipated due to previous behavior patterns regarding a similar instance of this type of code. Now again, I do want to apologize for the first video because I kinda name dropped the Yandere dev and then just left that topic hanging there. But for the longest time while I was watching the whole Balatro issue go down, all I could think of was that a very boring topic became an explosive issue for people that would have otherwise not even engaged with the discussion just because people saw that it was a giant if-else stack. Why else would the gaming community care so much about such an arbitrary thing other than that they were conditioned into thinking that this type of code is bad without understanding why programmers are saying that? Why were so many people rushing to snobbily lecture to me about how Lua doesn't have switch cases, despite the fact that I never even brought up a switch in my original video? What could have caused people to even think that this code was going to result in harassment if there is only one notable time that gamers organized a hate mob on a developer over code, rather than the expected content that usually results in this behavior? Throughout the whole time I've looked at this issue, I've been noticing behaviors that should not make sense if this has nothing to do with Yandere Dev, because gamers don't just go after developers unless they fail to provide something that they expected out of the game, and Balatro was not a bad game. Anyway, I want to move on a bit to talk about the reason why people even had this conversation about if-else over switch cases, because you have to understand where this joke even came from, right? So around 2020, some people started getting impatient with the game not coming out yet, and a couple people took the incentive to decompile his demo. Whatever the reason is, I'm not entirely sure, but it would make sense if it was to identify what could be making his game run so poorly, as that was a big issue for the longest time. Not too long after, he was asked on his Discord server why he didn't use a switch on his source code, and his justification to summarize was that a switch was not humanly readable like an if-else, which takes dev time away due to you needing to decode the statement, and his use cases are in parts of the game that don't affect the frame rate, although he confronts the idea that he exclusively uses if-else and will only use it if he needs to. So, yeah, I don't think you need to be a programmer to know what is wrong with this kind of mentality. Mind you, this guy's self-appointed as an expert programmer before as well, and seeing this goofball deliberately sabotage his architecture because of an issue that has kind of not been a problem for anyone in this field since the 1840s might be a little indication that he is in fact not a disciplined programmer, and it fills the hole behind why is this game not out yet pretty well, because the answer is very simple. The guy making it doesn't actually know what the hell he is doing, but he's too prideful to admit that he needs help. And that should have just been the end of that conversation, right? He was outed as a bad programmer and tried to justify it, so people were mocking him by repeating the if-else meme towards him in frustration with his constant delays and misuse of backer funding, among several separate controversies. However, we get a little problem here, and you can find it by looking at how people talk about his code. Never mind the fact that this fake image tends to be the most popular critique given to him, which means people were getting mad at code he didn't even make. But when you see how people talk about his code and trying to provide surface level solutions to it, you get the impression that they don't quite understand the issue with his code architecture and are assuming that the problem is as resolvable as a lift and shift to a switch case. The guy is a complete fool, but I can give the benefit of the doubt towards why he didn't make such a simple change despite being assumed to be the best option for many, and that's probably because it's not actually that simple. So what is the deal with conditional branching? Let's say I got this if-else condition and it iterates over two conditions. For the most part, not an offending article of code yet. So let's say I add two more. It's a little more busy, but it's still not too big of a deal. But then we say there's like 50 of these, and some people might start to say that you got yourself a problem here. And at this point, I want you to think of a reason why it's an issue, because it's important that you ask yourself this if you want to understand why the criticism given to this type of code is kind of bullshit if you ask anyone why his code was bad. Also, before I move on, there is a difference between nested if and iterating over conditions, although some might interpret this as an interchangeable term. So for the sake of clarity, nested if is when you put a condition inside another condition, which can be used if you have many items that match your first condition and want to look for something more specific. And iterating your conditions is where you pass an item over a bunch of other conditions and then it's moved over to the one that matches what the condition was looking for. So think of it like a switch case, except you took everything out of what makes a switch case useful. This is not an important distinction to talk about for this conversation, but it is important in its own sense when you see people saying that you need to slap on a switch to some code without considering what the code is actually doing. And this code we are talking about is a mix of both of these kinds of conditional branches, so it is nice to know the difference. Now, I haven't seen the code before because it's not readily available, but I did find a blog post by Joseph Miller from 2020 that actually approached this discussion where they broke down in great detail about how a switch case is not going to fix the game. They actually developed a couple dummy programs on C that iterated over a bunch of cases and calculated its execution timings. He wanted to find out how faster a switch was over if-else and found that his timings was 20 times faster with the switch for this specific test. For the sake of talking about the performance issue from his discovery, he also explained that the timing of an iteration on the raw if-else chain would need more or less around 130,000 iterations every frame on a single thread to impact the frame rate by 5% on a game expected to run at 120 FPS. He brings up that if we look at the update routine function, that by itself has 1,000 if statements and runs across 100 students. So in a worst case scenario, we are running 100,000 cases every frame just from that function alone. So we found the problem, right? Well, not really, because we are looking for a worst case scenario, and every iteration you get on runtime is probably not going to be that very last if statement. So sometimes that check is really long, but it can also be just about as fast to negligibly slower to a switch statement if all your iterations get caught by the earlier if statements. You have to remember that a large if-else stack doesn't slow down every iteration, it just slows down the iteration that has to look through every check before it gets to the one that it needs to go to. From a review by the same blog poster about that function I just mentioned, he doubted that the most frequent functions per entity running that script would rarely pass the 6,300 mark out of the proposed worst case 100,000, meaning that a switch case would help, but it's not going to actually be a noticeable difference. There's a lot more explanation behind why it didn't just work, but I mean, you can read, give the man some clicks on his blog. I think the reason why it wasn't called out sooner is 1, it's a 4-year-old joke, and it's kind of a bit unfair to be reviewing someone else's old-ass code that we don't even know is still around. 2, even if you really wanted to check it out, the source code is kinda inaccessible unless you're confident enough to think that the average YouTuber somehow has the time or experience to whip out their copy of Ghidra to find out for themselves. And 3, people just fucking hate Alex Mahon so much that even professional programmers literally spelling out to their audiences that this was not the issue wasn't good enough for the people that spearheaded this shit show. It was a meme that was specifically made to get under the guy's skin and really piss him off.
Yeah? So what's your point? All I did was put people in here. It's the world that really kills them, isn't it?
However, because of the fact that gamers don't give a shit about coding, and memes are so well known for carrying its original context, the joke kind of became video game development scripture for people who don't make video games. It's not as fun to say, the code's lack of any fundamental practice of object-oriented programming resulted in several instances of code that could otherwise have been preventable towards its impact of the game's frame rate, when you could just say, if you use if-else, your game's just gonna run like shit. And most people are just gonna take that ball and run with the faster explanation, even though its presence is a condition of the issue and not the root cause. And it's not like anybody's gonna call it out in today's environment. Lord fucking knows I tried. Accountability is not gonna mean jack shit anymore if the people we look up to are just gonna be as shitty as the person we were supposed to be mad at. That said, I totally get why people do it so much though. A lot of the people that we see that are part of a massive controversy don't actually tend to see much jail time or are usually back in business a couple months like it never happened. It is not like you can just ignore it either. When one of the largest accounts on Twitter is just straight up doxing your peers because they said something the account didn't like, and the platform looks at this and says that there was no wrongdoing, leaving the platform isn't really just gonna fix the fact that someone is still doxing people on a weekly basis over a culture war they made up. I don't really expect people to agree with me because obviously this is Alex Mahon of all people we are defending here, but what you really need to understand from all of this is that we need to learn how to let some shit go for once if we want to move on from having our bi-monthly Twitter debate about the ethics of if-else stacks every fucking time a developer gets their source code leaked. Like, we should not have been this aggressive towards people we were talking about in the Balatro Lua file without straight up sucking off the developer, because those people are absolutely right that the code we saw was not very good code, and the general gaming community is absolutely correct that this can and will become an unfair talking point used to criticize game developers, given that most of the time, this issue is arbitrary towards its impact on game development. But if you can't be fucked to put 2 and 2 together here, then you're gonna keep missing the point whenever we have this discussion every single time we bring it up again. Because there's always gonna be another Yandere dev. There's always gonna be another line of code that people are gonna make fun of. It's an inevitability. But it is also up to you to stop this dumbass cycle we put ourselves into because we love to feed someone else's 8-year-old vendetta.